Welcome to this morning's webinar, and thank you for joining us here today. Thank you, Mel and the FDEA, for once again inviting me to speak to you. So hold on to your hats. It's going to be a deep dive. So our goal today is really to arm you with a bit of granular detail on the complexities of considerations around ingredients compliance when exporting food and beverages to the EU. But you can actually use some of these to think about exporting wider. Some of these factors are ubiquitous. We are going to examine some key ingredients factors, not all of them, but we're going to include the compliance of brand new ingredients, sources of ingredients, and the use of vitamins and minerals in foods, as well as food additives use. So you as food businesses are looking to innovate with new flavours and formulations. So understanding these compliance factors is becoming increasingly important. So let's begin with an intro to Ashbury. For those of you who don't know us, I have to do this bit. We're founded in 2002, and we're the trusted compliance partner for many of the UK's leading retailers and increasingly some manufacturers too. Our clients include Marks and Spencer's, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Waitrose, and Aldi. We are global, and we have entities in the US and Australia, should you be thinking of exporting into those markets. So in our previous webinar, if you did attend, we looked at the broad set of factors which must be considered when first developing a food product. And we illustrated that they should be considered concurrently as you begin your NPD journey and your journey to market. But in today's session, we are going to focus in on those formulation factors, your recipe and your ingredients. The first consideration, though, I'd like to draw that back a little bit, is really perhaps to understand what category your food or beverage sits in. For example, is your food a food that's likely to be regarded as a food supplement, or will it be seen in some member states as a medicinal product, which is entirely possible? In terms of the use of food additives as well, you'll have to consider and understand which food category under that piece of legislation your food fits into. Is it regarded as confectionery or as a bakery product, for instance, because that will affect the additives you can use. The recent Marks and Spencer's Sando VAT debate did highlight for us the issues around categorisation of food types. By the way, confectionery is defined as, and I'll have to read this, any form of food normally eaten with the fingers and prepared by a cooking process other than baking that contains a substantial amount of sweetening agent. So sometimes those categorisations aren't all that helpful. But such distinctions will indeed affect the way your food needs to be labelled, formulated and certified in some cases as well. And it will affect the way that's going to be marketed in the member states of the EU. Really to illustrate this, a liquid food supplement, for example, if you're going to place that onto the Irish market, you'll need to notify that product to the competent authority. However, if your food is a functional beverage, rather than a food supplement, that notification will not be required. So let's have a look, just to illustrate one of those contentious areas of categorisation of types of food before we dive into ingredients. The definition of a food supplement, I touched on it a minute ago, is directly taken here from the EU directive on food supplements, as you can see. And whilst the definition of a beverage does relate to an EU HMRC interpretation, it would also apply in the EU. Add to that the definition of a fortified food or drink is a food or drink to which one or more micronutrients have been added, but which does not have its main purpose as the supply of micronutrients. So I hope you can begin to see some of those complexities around really understanding the category your food, your beverage, your product's going to sit into before you consider export. Carrying on from the previous slide, looking at food supplements and beverages, here we look at some of the legal definitions and regulations that might apply to products using ingredients that could be considered to have a physiological effect, such as CBD, as you can see here, or in vitamins and minerals, which we'll look at later in a bit more detail. So botanical ingredients are a growing area, aren't they? So when using these, it's possible that they may be considered to have a physiological effect, and may be regarded as food ingredients in some cases, or may be regarded as having pharmacological effects in other member states. So it's a tricky area. You may also be aware of the recent EU changes to the safe levels that have been used in guidance for levels of CBD in products. The European Food Safety Authority dramatically reduced its recommended maximum daily intake to only 2 milligrams. This was from about 70, I think, and this is now, of course, not in line with our own FSA recommendation of a maximum intake of 10 milligrams. So the intersection of foods and medicinal products and traditional herbal remedies are laid out there for you. And that's something you've got to consider. So let's now focus in on formulations or ingredients compliance. Here I've tried to broadly illustrate some of the key and emerging areas of diversification and focus that you'll need to consider when you're formulating your product. So following Brexit, of course, we've learned to our cost that Great Britain and the EU and NI are now very different markets. And the movement of products from one to the other is as complex as an export into one or the other from a third country. So that's important to think about when you are thinking about where you're going to sell your products. So whilst the EU is a single customs territory with overarching rules that apply throughout it, individual member state countries do have the ability to make their own rules in some areas of food standards where an EU directive or an adopted regulation is the source of those requirements. So let's explain some of the factors illustrated here a little bit. Depending on the nature, of course, of your raw materials, the consideration here of permitted source may cover requirements of EUDR, or it may be pertinent in relation to a country's approval for the export of products of animal origin to the EU. New food controls. How are novel foods that have no history of previously being consumed in the EU permitted? Well, we'll talk through that later, as indeed, of course, they are controlled. Processing aids, that's a really complex area, especially where you've got protected agricultural products, which are highly protected in the EU, such as wine and olive oil, which are subject to marketing standards. These do dictate descriptions, production and processing techniques, and the labelling of those products. Food additives are that we consider them here really because they are only permitted in specific food types or categories and at specific levels. Fortification of foods may be mandated by regulations, such as we have in GB via the bread and flours regulations, or they could be via, in Belgium, rules requiring that margarines and spreadable fats are fortified with vitamin D. So as we go through today's sessions, I hope we'll explore the interaction between these compliance factors. So let's begin with material sources of your raw materials. In considering the sources of your raw materials or ingredients, a positive factor, if there is one, is that the European Union can be deemed to be unified in the acceptance of raw materials and ingredients from third countries. Each EU border control country and control post should be enforcing controls on origin of raw materials in the same way. However, we know that that can be different. But in order to be able to export foods containing products of animal origin, you've got some very specific requirements. So those products, any nature of product of animal origin, you will need to tease out those complex controls before you think about exporting into the EU. The EU has amended the official controls regulations, which we have in GB as 2017-625 for you reg nuts. They've amended those control regulations about 30 times since we left following the transition period of Brexit. So we have a diversity of controls. So don't think the same apply in GB and throughout the EU. So whilst in Great Britain, you're probably familiar with the Border Target Operating Model, or BTOM, which risk rates products by way of factors such as, is it shelf stable? Is it frozen chilled? What's the HS code? What's the percentage of product of animal origin in there? The EU situation is markedly different. So percentages of product of animal origin ingredients in any particular recipe are not considered as factors in determining whether a product requires controls such as export health certification, private attestation, or whether it's permitted at all into the union. Any food which isn't shelf stable, containing an animal product that's not a highly refined product of animal origin, does require export health certification to enter. And those products of animal origin ingredients must also, importantly, conform to any treatment requirements specifically laid out for that ingredient, that species, and that particular country of origin. A really good example is milk, which is a particularly problematic area. So milk used in confectionery may appear to present a pretty low risk, it's shelf stable, etc. However, sources of milk should be carefully assessed for compliance, because no milk can be used in any product and legally exported to the EU if the originating country does not have an approved residues control plan. Now, those cover the national systems to ensure pharmacologically active substances like veterinary residues, veterinary medicine residues, pesticides, and some environmental contaminants are not present in that product of animal origin. A recent example I was involved in a little bit was the importation of Dubai-style chocolate, which contained a milk from China. A really good example of the complexities. So, permission to export products of animal origin is given by species. As a reminder, a product type and treatment and processing also apply to that permission. An example of this is Brazil. So Brazil's got a long history of being able to export beef products to the EU and beyond, but pork products and derived products are not permitted from Brazil. And considering EUDR, whilst there's been plenty of sort of toing and froing in respect of the EU deforestation regulation and many delays to its implementation, understanding the scope of the regulation in terms of what products are covered by it, listed in the annex, you must be able to understand that, and what products are going to need documented evidence that they are not originating from areas subject to deforestation. You've also got to understand your obligations under those regulations. Are you an operator, etc.? And lastly, turning to high-risk foods not of animal origin, that's what that acronym stands for. These are agri-commodities that are subject to temporary bans on import, increased checks, and documentation on testing, as they are considered at high risk of chemical, microbiological, and naturally occurring contaminations, such as aflatoxin contamination. The EU does review those lists frequently, and it updates the lists of those controlled products every 6 months. So a good way to understand if those controls are coming into play is to look at the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, or RASAF, and I can pop the link in the chat for you later. So definitely monitoring changes to those regulations is critical. What about new food controls? It may seem odd, but we've come across a lot of these issues recently at Ashbury over the past sort of 6 months. The EU position on the controls of new food is quite different, if you've ever dealt with the US, from that of the US, and is also beginning to diversify from the GB controls. Fundamentally, any food not consumed to a significant degree in one of the member states of the EU prior to the 15th of May 1997, doesn't seem so long ago for some of us, is regarded as a novel food. And novel foods does also include the traditional foods from third countries, and all of these must be assessed for safety and approved at an EU level prior to being marketed in the member states. And the graphic you can see here illustrates the factors that would need to be considered to ascertain if a food was novel in the EU, an ingredient. It can be deemed novel if it's a familiar food, but it's subjected to a new technology treatment. It's completely newly synthesized. It's a familiar substance from a new source, or it's a traditional food from outside of the EU member states. And any new novel food has to be approved, as we said, by the competent authority before being utilised as a food or an ingredient. That assessment process is, no surprise, quite cumbersome, expensive and long-winded in the EU. GB are attempting to lessen the burden for food businesses in that respect. But for the traditional foods, it's a little less onerous and requires only some data showing a history of safe consumption in that third country for at least 25 years, and that can be a little bit easier to achieve. So an illustration of one of these difficulties when considering new ingredients or novel foods is the use of plant extracts. So in an effort to clean label, a lot of suppliers of ingredients are inclined to categorise their extracts as berry extracts and not additives. They're categorising them as food ingredients that adding flavour. It's important to know that the primary reason for the use of the ingredient is likely to dictate whether it's going to be sitting in the category of a novel food or outside of this regime as a food additive, because food additives are not covered by novel foods controls. But we'll come back to this when we talk about food additives a little later. Importantly, if you are unsure as to if an ingredient you're using is a novel ingredient, you are obliged to consult the competent authority where you intend to market that food in the EU. One of the most difficult aspects is probably finding out if an ingredient you want to use is indeed regarded as novel or whether it's accepted as being a food with a history of consumption. So recently, the Swedish authorities, you may have heard about it, have asked the EU Commission to decide on the novel food status of Bacillus coagulans. Seems to be a fairly familiar product, but when used as an ingredient for fresh greens, sprinkled on as a liquid or powder, the question from the Swedish authorities was to the Commission, is this novel? And indeed, they have deemed it novel. That approval process, if you fancy tackling it, is onerous. As I said, it takes about 2.5 years and does require in the EU currently renewal every 10 years, but that is probably beginning to change. So next on the list of problematic ingredients are food additives, flavourings and enzymes. These substances are all regulated products, meaning that they're subject to compositional standards. They've got to be approved before being placed on the market or used. Excuse me. And the food additives control regime does identify 27 different additive functions. In the EU, there are approximately 330-ish authorised food additives and a total of 2,500 flavouring substances that are all authorised. Excuse me. The list of permitted food additives and flavouring substances changes fairly frequently, so it's important to monitor those regulations illustrated here for some changes. Each approved additive, of course, has got a defined level that's permitted in different food types. They're laid out in the regulations. They're also laid out in the EU database on the use of additives, but I would caution the use of that solely as it does contain several errors. Any use of those additives outside those listed food types and categories or levels is not permitted. Therefore, you've got to understand which product category your food might fall into under those regulations. They're not exactly the same as any other categorization, sadly. So do understand that before you sort of agree to the use of an additive in your food. As you can see from the framework diagram, flavourings, smoke flavourings and food enzymes are actually regulated separately from food additives. But understanding the difference between a processing aid and a food additive, we find that very difficult for our advisors here at Ashbury. It is critical to understanding the labelling and use requirements in the EU for processing aids. There They're not all permitted in all member states, but we'll come on to that later. I thought it worth bringing this up because in recent weeks we've seen several issues arising from the interpretation of the function and nature of extracts. We did mention them earlier, and they straddle a particularly difficult area of interpretation as far as regulatory regimes go. However, what I'd say is if the extract, this plant extract, is concentrated beyond that which you'd expect to be sort of used for a flavouring purpose, so that it's sort of devoid of all the natural variants and constituents that you'd find in an ingredient, such as the one on the left, and its primary purpose is an additive function. In the case of this, it might be antioxidant. So a lot of these berry extracts, etc., are really being introduced to the food as antioxidants, not as a flavouring. You must really understand from your supplier, etc., what the purpose of this extract is. So another consideration here is it a food ingredient at all? Is it an additive? And if it's not a food additive, it may well be in scope of the novel foods regulations. This is an issue which one of our manufacturers came up against fairly recently in relation to a berry extract. So food additives, enzymes and flavourings are all outside of the scope of the novel foods regulations, but if you want to use it as a food ingredient, your particular extract, be aware that it may be covered by novel foods requirements. So this is a difficult area to sort of tease out as to the permissibility of any ingredient. So what I've done here is just lay out for your reference a number of the different definitions pulled from the regulations around botanicals and extracts. So hopefully you'll find that useful. One of the really good reasons for understanding whether a substance used in a formulation is a processing aid or not, a carryover additive, or a food additive is really due to the lack of harmonisation of regulation of processing aids throughout the EU. The additives regulation, which is 1333/2008, for you that want to know, is within that regulation, it does give member states the authority to govern and control processing aids that are not used as food additives within their own territories. So the chart here is really a piece of work we did trying to look at the differences in use of processing aid, and it's drawn for a number of key EU member states. Forgive Luxembourg for slipping into losing its G at the end there. And it really illustrates where processing aids are controlled and can't be used outside those approved and listed in those member states. So again, hopefully you'll find that a useful piece of reference. So it really points to asking the question of supply of any ingredients as to what it is that you are adding to your food. And the table here is really an attempt to illustrate the sort of complicated EU level situation in respect of processing aids. It's not harmonised across the EU, as I said. So as we saw on the previous slide, some member states may have instituted controls concerning these substances. However, there are some overarching principles which are illustrated here. Any substance used must be safe, as defined, and not present any toxicological danger in the residues they leave behind in the food. So importantly, it's really the responsibility of you as the food business operator placing that final food on the market to ensure that all the substances used or present in it in any way are safe and legal to use. So really interrogate any information provided to you by suppliers of ingredients, or indeed any information provided by manufacturing sites. Another recent issue, and fairly recurring over the past 6 months, to be honest, in terms of trade with the EU, is fortified foods. The interpretation really of the GB mandatory requirements for fortification of flour and breads for use in products that will be exported to the EU. So I thought it really worth bringing that to the table here today. Before the changes that happened to the bread and flour regulations, or the BFRs, in 2024, the EU regulation on fortification of foods, which you can see here, did not align with the BFRs in GB. Happily, that has been corrected in 2024 amendments, and the levels of fortification do now reflect what would be regarded as a significant level of vitamins and minerals required under that EU regulation. And that EU regulation does apply actually to voluntary and mandatory addition of vitamins and minerals and other substances to food. So it is pertinent to supplements, fortified foods and beverages, and those products such as margarines and spreads in Belgium and flours in GB that are mandatorily fortified. Member states do and still impose mandatory fortification for specific products on their market, but this is done within the framework of this regulation and with Commission oversight. But if you use a GB fortified flour in a product, how does that work? The fortification will be regarded in the EU as a voluntary fortification, not a mandatory fortification, and it'll be covered under that regulation 1925/2006. That regulation gives a requirement that any voluntary fortifications are only permitted if they use the vitamins and minerals or the types of vitamins and minerals that are on the positive lists that are listed in Annex 1 and 2 of that regulation, and also that the vitamins and minerals used are added to the ingredients list, and we'll see an example of that later. If there are any nutritional claims being made, or you highlight the presence in any way of the vitamin and mineral that you're using, they must also appear in the nutrition information. But importantly, there is no requirement. I'm so pleased I finally found the Commission communication on this. No requirement to ensure that any final finished food using flour or any other fortified ingredient does, at the end of the day, in its final finished form, contain a significant level of those vitamins and minerals. They must simply be added to the ingredients list. The regulation on fortified foods provides that they can set different levels, sadly, of recommended daily intakes and upper limits for vitamins and minerals added to foods within the parameters of the fortification regulation. So this table lays out a number of the member states, key member states, which have imposed some different levels of specific vitamins and minerals for their populace that differ from the generalised EU levels dictated. And I think the Netherlands is a particularly interesting example, because here they've got a daily intake of vitamin A that's set at considerably higher than the EU generalised level. They set it at 750 micrograms for men, which is a long way above the EU level, which is generally 600 micrograms. And the Netherlands sets them for the genders differently, which is pretty unusual amongst the member states. So these factors are critical if you're going into the EU and you're planning to make a claim about your food being perhaps a source of vitamins and minerals, or you plan on using an approved health claim in relation to the positive effects of any added vitamin and mineral. So again, I hope you'll be able to use this as some useful reference. We touched on it, but I'll emphasize it again. The two key food considerations, food information considerations for fortified foods in the EU, or the use of a fortified ingredient such as flour, are the ingredients list, requiring that you do indicate the presence of vitamins and minerals used as ingredients in the list, as you can see here from that example, and the provision of clear and compliant nutrition information table if you've added vitamins and minerals and they are present at an amount which is deemed significant. So we have to go back to the food information regulation to find out that that means 15% of recommended daily intake if it's a food, or 7.5% if it's a beverage. Again, a good reason to understand what you're selling. Whilst a number of member states do govern the fortification of food slightly differently, and certainly differently from GB, we do have the possibility in the medium term of a sanitary and phytosanitary deal. Cross-border trade should then be a little bit easier, as the regulations should be aligned by 2027, we hope. So, in summary, I hope we've been able to illustrate that ingredients compliance factors for export to the EU are pretty interlinked and not necessarily harmonised across the member states as well. But an important thing to remember is that in the EU, the principle of the internal market of the EU will mean that if you carefully consider where you're entering into the EU, what border country you're going to first send your food into, distribution throughout the EU should be reasonably trouble-free based on the principle of the free movement within the internal market. So that brings us to the end of the session. I hope you've enjoyed it and you'll be able to take some useful tips away. And we do have time for a few questions if you've got any at all. I hope I can answer. If I can't, I will post back to Mel if you left any questions in the chat as well. So the summary, really, I couldn't say it better than it's written there. Thank you for listening, and do get in touch if you would like any help from us at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Do you want to stop sharing your screen? And then we do have a few questions in the chat box. Thank you. I mean, it sounds like a complete minefield of regulations and different references and things that you need to look out for. So yeah, getting some clarification on exactly what's needed is definitely helpful. We do have a few questions regarding processing aids to Ireland. Any particular domestic controls?
No, I do not think that. Oh, I can't see myself. I hope you can see me. You see me?
Yeah, we can see
Okay.
you.
That, as far as I've been able to ascertain, there aren't any particular controls on processing aids in Ireland other than the overarching sort of EU considerations we gave in that table. So is it safe? Have you got the information that it's a safe processing aid? It's really difficult to define. So what I'd say is go back and make sure that you are talking about a processing aid. So it's something that's used to facilitate the production of the food rather than something which has a sort of technological function in the food. So discerning that can be really difficult, and oftentimes even our advisors are pulling their hair out trying to understand if it's a processing aid or a carried over food additive from a use in a raw material ingredient. But no, as far as I am aware, Ireland doesn't have any specific domestic regs on those.
Okay, great, thank you. Yvonne, hopefully that answers your question. If you want to take yourself off mute, if you have got anything more that you wanted to ask, then please go ahead.
Anything that you think of, because I think a lot of the time this sort of presentation will make you think of some questions subsequently. We've had time to digest it, so
Yeah,
absolutely do get in touch if it prompts anything from you.
there is a request for if you can share, Rebecca, the Commission communications about fortification on final product. Not
Yes.
needing, yeah.
I count that as a bit of a win that I managed to find that. That is, I will do. I'll share that link. That actually was hard to find because that only communication was in 2021. There wasn't any subsequent sort of communication. So certainly over the past sort of 2 months, we've had, I think that there'll be 3 manufacturers come with questions regarding that and the presentation of the fortifying ingredients, how they should be presented in the ingredients list. I know a lot of retailers are choosing to do it alphabetically because of the requirement to list ingredients in descending order by weight. Does that apply to those compound ingredients where the little example you saw? Yeah, it's the steer from the FSA is that it's okay to do it alphabetically, although I'm not entirely certain about that. I would say still continue with the overarching do it in descending order by weight, whether it's a compound ingredient or not. So we've had some debate about that, and others just simply about the scope of those mandatory fortifications for bread and flour. We use bread and flour as an ingredient everywhere, don't we? So it has become a particular talking point. But yes, I'll share that, no problem.
And a question about just, is it assuming it's necessary to feature nutrients in the ingredients list?
It is. So if you have added micronutrients, so your vitamins and minerals, we talk about those as micronutrients. This is an interesting one. So this connect, which is why I gave bread and flour as an example, because those are added. They may not feature significantly in the final food. So if you're making a biscuit and you've got some yummy chocolate and bits and bobs on top, the level of the micronutrients in the flour is not going to mean that the end product has got a significant amount in it. Now, what the EU want to see is if it's in there in a significant amount, then you need to put it in the nutrition table at the bottom. So below those normal nutrients that you'll see, fiber, protein, etc., they all sit at the bottom, but only do that if it's a significant amount. So those rules as well are slightly different, just to be caution you if you are looking at a food supplement. So some of those sort of small, tiny beverage bottles, really and honestly, they're food supplements. So you have to be very careful about understanding the interaction with the requirements for nutrition labeling as they regard fortified foods or food supplements. But yes, if it's significant, it'll need to be in the nutrition table. If it's not significant because it's been added as part of something like fortified flour, then it's only the ingredients list. Don't put it in the nutrition table.
Okay. Anybody else got any more questions? Is there a certain percentage of animal-based product that triggers ID or hygiene mark? Thinking of oil animal fat blend, which is predominantly animal.
Oh,
that's quite
case
specific.
by case basis, but do come to us, Yvonne. Now, a really good example of this we found is a fish oil supplement. That's the recent one I've come up against.
Yeah.
So is that a product of animal origin or is it a composite food? That's the key, understanding whether you've got a composite food product or a product of animal origin requiring an ID mark. So the little oval mark, that's what we're talking about when we talk about the ideal ID mark. You do use the term health mark as well. So that little oval, did it need to go on these fish oil supplements or not? Because the definition of a composite food is where you've got a product of animal origin in combination with plant-based ingredients that give it a character. That's the key. So what we found was that these fish oil supplements were in a hydrocellulose capsule, so it's a plant-based capsule. Did that make it a thing that was a composite? No. And what we found was that they'd assumed it was a composite food. There was no ID mark being added to the packaging where it should have been. So those distinctions are very different. So no, in essence, into the EU, there is no percentage that will dictate that. You have to understand, is it a composite? And is it a highly refined product of animal origin? Because that takes it out of scope, perhaps. But yeah, case by case basis. Very complicated.
Yeah, I would suggest perhaps putting Yvonne in touch with you directly to talk a bit more specifically about certain products. If anybody else has any questions, please do either come off mute now and ask away or pop it in the chat box. So it's down to the character. We need a glass of wine or two to discuss
Yes.
this. Thank you very much. Yes.
I'll join you.
I know it does get down when you're looking at the nitty-gritty of labels in compliance. It does become, yeah, a bit of a minefield, as we said earlier. But yes, I mean, Rebecca and Ashbury are there to help you with this, absolutely. So I will share all the different contact details for them along with the recording of the webinar as well. And I think you were going to provide a link, Rebecca, for the non-animal origin.
Yes, yes, I've got it. It's just a
Reference.
question. It's a question of navigating my way through Zoom to put it there. 'Cause
Oh,
I've got
don't worry. If you
questions.
send it to me, then I'll make sure it's sent to everybody as
I
well, so
will.
they've got that as reference, so they can have a look
I'll
at
do
that
it
as
straight
well.
away.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. If there's anything more, I think we might be done on the questions. I'll just double check. Yeah, so all that's left is for me to say thank you very much to Rebecca for your time this morning. It's really, really useful to get these kind of updates intermittently on things that have changed. It always seems to be a changing fluid process as
Changing
well.
soon. Yeah.
Yeah. So as I said, the recording will go around with Rebecca's contact details. So if you do have any further questions for her, do get in touch. But thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you, guys. Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone. Goodbye.